Hey everybody, Bob Knakal, Chairman and CEO of BKREA, coming to you on the Bob Knakal Show. And this week we have such a great show for you. My guest is MaryAnne Gilmartin, the founder and CEO of MAG Partners. New York City is such a competitive landscape in real estate and particularly in development, dominated by mostly men. And MaryAnne is a woman that has really made tremendous strides in the business and is one of the top developers in New York today. And she was nice enough to come by, spend some time with us and tell her story, which is really fascinating. Amazing some of the things she's done. And we have to thank our great friends at Crexi who sponsor the Bob Knakal Show. Crexi, we use it all the time, every day. It is the most powerful platform on which to prospect, research, analyze, and do any commercial real estate transaction that you want to do. If you don't have Crexi, get Crexi. Great platform. We love it. You'll love it. Crexi, thank you so much for what you do for us. Let's get to the show. Hey, everybody. Bob Knakal, Chairman and CEO of BKREA, coming to you on another episode of the Bob Knakal Show, and I could not be more excited today. You know, we talk about commercial real estate being a primarily male-dominated business. Well, real estate development in New York City is definitely disproportionately dominated by men, except for our guest today. I couldn't be more excited to have my good friend and one of the top real estate developers in New York City here, MaryAnne Gilmartin, who is the founder and CEO of MAG Partners. MaryAnne, welcome to the show.
Hey, Bob. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. So this business you got into, Queens girl, you're taking over Manhattan and New York City. Why don't you tell us a little bit about growing up in Queens, what that was like, and how you got into the real estate business?
Sure. Well, I was born in Rockaway, and my mother grew up in Rockaway, and she was a hippie. And my father left when I was very young, and she wanted to go back to a place that, for her, had very, very fond memories. And so when she found her second husband, they decided that we would all pick up and move to Woodstock. And at the time, I thought it was a terrible idea. This was not in the plan. I think a city girl going up to Woodstock, New York.
How old were you at the time?
I was in middle school, and I'd say Woodstock, for those folks that know Woodstock, is not like the festival. You know, it's at the time, it really was an outpost for IBM. It was a big IBM community where a lot of people's families worked for IBM in Kingston, New York. And so I was a fish out of water. I felt like I wanted to grow up in the city. It wasn't my choice. In the end of the day, I think it was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. And I was able to excel in an environment that was very different than the environment that I was growing up in the city. And then I was able to come back to New York around the time that I was going to university. And so I am a full-on New Yorker. I'd say that the city kid in me was able to come back home, and I never left for longer than, say, a year at a time since that moment.
Fantastic. And you went to Fordham. So what made you the decision to go to Fordham and come back to the city?
I often tell this story because it's true, and I think it gets to this issue of what does it mean to be resilient? That gentleman that my mother married wasn't an easy fella. He was a libertarian, and I didn't even know what a libertarian was, but I learned the hard way. I found out that he believed that the government was taxing him illegally, and he stopped paying his taxes. And we know that you can choose not to pay taxes. You just can't choose not to file your taxes. And so my stepfather was in trouble, big trouble, and moved all of his assets into my name. And I found this out when I applied for financial aid. And I owned a home, a motorcycle, 2 cars, and a boat, of which I owned none of it. They were getting divorced, and I had to explain this bizarre situation, realizing that these assets were put in my name. And so I had to appeal to each of the schools that accepted me but rejected my financial aid request. And it was Fordham, love the Jesuits, that gave me a hearing and sat down and listened to me explain this bizarre situation. And so I headed to the Bronx. My stepfather headed to prison. He was in the municipal correction facility in Lower Manhattan, and I went to the Bronx. And that's the way that story ended. But I think that I really had to fight my way through a very bizarre and very, very taxing situation to demonstrate that I had nothing. And Fordham gave me a scholarship and they gave me financial aid. And for that, I made the decision to go there, and obviously have a very, very soft place in my heart for Fordham, given that their humanity was on full display.
Well, and being able to explain your way out of a very complicated situation was great training for real estate.
Yes.
But real estate, you did not get into real estate intentionally. Why don't you talk a little bit about you get out of school and the circuitous route you took to get into this business of ours?
Well, getting to school was hard enough, and I decided once I was there that I meant business, and so I worked 2 jobs. I waited tables in New York City, Manhattan, and I worked a work-study job and got through school, did very, very well. I was a Phi Beta Kappa summa cum laude when I graduated, and I had a professor that said to me, "You really should apply for this fellowship program. It's an urban fellowship program." The great Ed Koch had one big idea, many ideas, but this idea was that young people really should try public service before they head into the private sector. You needed to be matriculated into a graduate program, and I was on my way to law school. I applied for this fellowship and I won. And the advice they gave you upon winning was that you should really use it to try something very different and not do whatever it is that you're inclined to study or to be when you grow up. I can't say that I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, but I did believe I was going to law school and I was going to fight for the rights of juveniles in the justice system. So I interviewed with Ben Ward, the police commissioner, and this was after the city was in some very difficult times, and so nobody had any ability to hire new talent, and urban fellows were supposed to be hard-fought fellowships, and so all the commissioners wanted urban fellows. But you got to interview the commissioners to say, like, why should I come to your agency? Why would I pick you? It's a very interesting thing
Little role reversal there.
completely. Like police commissioner of New York City, and of course, knowing absolutely nothing, graduating from undergraduate. I had a fascinating time interviewing all the commissioners. And to be honest with you, I rolled into the Public Development Corporation because I had a long list of agencies, and it was a corporation, carpet, air conditioning, a nice, beautiful sign behind the front desk, a receptionist. And it was so professional. There was a board of directors, and there was a president, not a commissioner. Steve Spinola had just become the head of REBNY. And the new head of public development said, like, you can shadow me, go to City Hall, meet the mayor, and you can learn something about what economic development is. And I thought, this is undeniably one of the most fascinating opportunities. And I had won 2 fellowships a summer in an academic year, and I thought, I'll just spend the summer here, and I'll get serious about the juveniles in September. And it was there that I was thrown into transactions, and I realized serendipitously that I had real estate development in my veins. And it was an amazing agency. It was a young agency that had really allowed young people to touch a lot of different, very, very large-scale projects.
And what type of transactions were those that you were exposed to?
My first transaction was College Point, Queens. It was an industrial park, and there was a squatter living on a site that was intended to be a tow pound for the New York City Police Department. And I remember thinking, okay, this project management thing, I'm the project manager, and I sit down and say, what do we have to do? And they said, you have to get rid of the squatter, but we can't communicate with the squatter because he's north of 85, he's emotionally disturbed, he's got 5 pit bulls and a shotgun, and he lives in a trailer. And I thought, wow, so who's in touch with him? And they said, well, no, we can't talk to him. And I thought, okay. So on the weekend, I got on the train. I went to College Point, Queens. I stood at the chain link fence. I called this very, troubled man over to the fence and asked if he would talk to me, and explained what condemnation was, how the marshals were going to come eventually, that we could do it in a way that served him, or it could be done to him, and that I wanted to be helpful. And so this was this situation.
Again, great training for real estate,
I said,
right?
if this is what real estate development is, like, it's exciting, it's the human condition at work, and I successfully got the squatter off the site, and it was problem solving, and I thought, I like this. And then, of course, I learned that in this agency, now remember, real estate developers, today everybody wants to be a real estate developer. I would say back then it was maybe like one step above a car salesman. It's not like people were getting out of college saying, I want to be a real estate developer. But I thought, this is fascinating. And of course, at that agency, which is now called the Economic Development Agency, you met every developer in New York City. And in the conference rooms, they would sit you around a table and saying, like, what do you think we should do at the west side of Manhattan or South Ferry? And you think, you're asking me? So it was as if you could dream it and defend it. You might be able to stand up a case for it. And so this agency was full of young talent. It was full of ambition. It was not bureaucratic. And it was one of Mayor Koch's favorite agencies. Those are the days that he'd be boarding up in a giant poster, boarding up the entrance to the tunnels to stop companies from leaving New York City. And I was in the agency that was structuring tax incentives to keep companies in New York City. And Carl Weisbrod ultimately took over the agency, and I was doing corporate retention. And I learned the math, I learned the policy, and I learned the business of public-private partnerships. And it was remarkable. I then quickly realized that if you don't have a mayor who believes that economic development is important to the health of a city, you don't have the same opportunity. And David Dinkins came in, and it was clear. I went through a couple of meetings and realized that the nexus between his social policy goals and objectives and what the tax base in New York City needed, what real estate contributed to the city's economy, that wasn't something that he believed in and felt strongly about. And I thought to myself, this has been a great run, but I need to leave.
And as a young person meeting with all those real estate developers, what were some of the first impressions you had, and any memorable meetings from back then that you really said, wow, this is really something?
Some more printable than others, but I'd say themes were, when you were just an apple in your mother's eye, do you know what I was doing? A lot of lecturing because I was young. And as you know, this is a dynasty business, lots of families and older white men that would talk at you.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were just some that were willing to recognize that if I had a job to do and I was at the table, that they would respect that. And for example, how I met Bruce Ratner was I negotiated the job training program for Bear Stearns in exchange for getting benefits to move to Brooklyn. And it was my job to deliver on what the city bargained for, right? The city wants the taxes, the city wants the job creation and the job training. So I went in, I had a mission, I knew what my job was, and Bruce respected that. And so he was one of the developers that obviously I had developed a lot of respect for, but it was really born of the fact that he respected my role. And it didn't matter how young I was prepared for the meetings. I had a job to do. And I did the job well enough that I felt like the city got what it bargained for.
And so you mentioned Bruce. How did it come about that you went to Forest City? And was there an interim step in between that position that you were in and joining Bruce?
Yeah, so now we're in the early 90s and left economic development and wanted very, very badly to be a developer on the private side. And it was a remarkable moment when you realize you're in public service and you're getting all this exposure and you're doing really, really big transactions, but you're doing it in public service. And realizing if you just simply crossed over to the other side of the table, you probably had the skill set. The objectives might be different on the private side, but that I had witnessed the coming together of these very, very large, complicated transactions. And I knew a lot more than I realized. And I thought, I think I can do it from the perspective of the real estate developer. And so I wanted to do that. I can say that the market was dead. It was early 90s.
Savings and loan crisis was the worst.
Nobody was building anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was asked to join a brokerage firm, Dan Gronick &
Remember
Company.
Dan very well.
And
Great
I said,
guy.
I don't see myself as a broker. It might be my control issues that I wasn't that interested in bringing people together. I really wanted to control one side or the other of the equation. Right. So I said that I would be an advisor. It might have been the beginnings of what ultimately became the consulting world of brokerage, right? Which is, I said, I think I can contribute a lot to companies that are moving around the country and might want to approach the government for tax incentives. And so I remember Starter was out of New Haven, and like Rob Martin was the broker, and I was an advisor and put together the tax proposal right. to the city of New Haven to keep them. So that's what I did. And I would tell you that in every bit of my being, I need to love what I do. And I was waiting out time. Didn't realize that the credibility and the props that I would get later on for being able to say to a broker, like I stood in your shoes, like I was on transactions where it was commission driven. And I did negotiate leases. And that period of time, which was just a few years, wasn't the finest time in my career because it really wasn't. I wasn't particularly good at it. I understood how important it was, and it was the lifeline to many transactions. That is the brokerage community, but it wasn't for me. So I was really waiting out the development cycle.
Right.
And then I got the call from Bruce, and I went over there in 94.
Well, I tell young people all the time, I think one of the best ways that you can learn is by putting yourself in an environment that may be a little bigger than you think you should be in, exposed to larger transactions, different transactions, things that you maybe feel you're not ready for, but that's the best way to learn. It sounds like that first position really put you in that spot to be exposed to things that were really very formative in terms of the way you looked at the world.
I had my when I knew what area of economic development I wanted to work in, there was a woman who I'm very, very close with now, but she said, "I don't want her. She doesn't know anything. She's an urban fellow. She got in. She worked for the office of the president. She doesn't have what it takes, and so I'm not taking her." And the more she said no, the more that I wanted it. And so she was saying this really through people that were quite senior in the organization, and she was resisting. And I literally went to see her and I said, "How about we just do 90 days? And if I don't make the cut in 90 days, I will accept that you don't want me in your group." And she is a dear friend and would say if she were sitting here that I was probably the best project manager she'd ever had. And it was born of this desire to prove her wrong and also learn the business and work really hard in doing that. And it was interesting that it was a woman because we laugh about how, sometimes we're harder on each other than maybe the opposite sex would be.
Yeah, sometimes that little pebble in your shoe can be the thing that spurs you to growth beyond what you would naturally be on course for.
And also this idea for young people of recognizing that there's a lot to be learned from finding something that doesn't work for you and that you don't like.
Mm.
Like my stint in brokerage was a really powerful period of time for me because it gave me clarity. And when you're young, I tell people it's not that you've made a mistake. You've actually crystallized your thinking. And I had so much respect for brokerage because I was in the business for a bit and I understood what it took. And I understand that some people just don't have what it takes. And I think I'm a really good developer. I don't think I would be a particularly good broker.
Yeah, well, finding what you like is very important because I think in any area of business, you have to work really hard. And it's really hard to work really hard unless you love what you're doing. So great to know what you like and what you don't like, that kind of thing. So, all right. So Bruce comes calling.
Yep.
Tell us about that.
So for those of you that, before Brooklyn was Brooklyn, right? The definition of success was getting the hell out of Brooklyn. And so he was building these first-class office buildings in Brooklyn as a way to stop companies from leaving New York City, which was very expensive, and going to places, not just New Jersey, but to Plano, Texas, right, to grow their companies. And so we became a third central business district, right, for the city of New York. And so it was Midtown, it was downtown, and this place called Brooklyn. But it was a lot to sell people on this idea that you'd pick up your company and move them to Brooklyn.
And what year was this, MaryAnne?
We're going now to early 94, 95,
Right,
96.
which was really way before Brooklyn had gotten there. I remember we opened, in MaryAnne days, we opened our Brooklyn office in 1999. And even at that time, the Manhattan brokers thought we were crazy for going over the river. They thought our shoes would get too dirty if we were, on the east side of the river. And that was really a very pioneering perspective back in those days.
It was a maverick move. It was a deal that was cut, again, with the support of the city to create this campus in downtown Brooklyn. But for many, it was an idea before its time. I mean, I remember that Koch would send, well, at that point, it wasn't Koch. It would be even Dinkins and subsequently Giuliani. They'd send people over the bridge and really say, you must look at Brooklyn. If you want a tax deal, we're not going to give you a tax deal, just stay in Midtown. You have to go someplace pioneering like Brooklyn. So I remember Japanese banks, they come over in a bulletproof limousine and they'd get out of the limo and they'd take one look around and they'd be like, thanks, but no thanks, get back in the limo. So I'd say the benefit of that hard sell was that we really needed to have sharp tools. We needed to compete on price. We needed to build it and build it for as cost competitively as possible. And to really say, if you picked this building up, and you moved it to Midtown, it would be 5 times, 10 times as expensive, but it's a high-quality building. And of course, it was Bear Stearns and J.P. Morgan that ultimately made decisions to come to Brooklyn. And, my inaugural deal was the New York City Fire Department. We built a headquarters for them at MetroTech. And that's really a deal I cut my teeth on. So my early days were building a building a year, but doing it under circumstances where we were selling something that was very, very difficult to sell.
And what was that first role with Bruce?
80 Main Lane was my first building because Bruce had bought it in a syndication, and he was looking to lease it. And so I found myself a principal using brokers to fill space there. And then I came to be a developer, and we had to be building something. So I think it was Bruce Surrey really was representing us in finding a tenant for a site we had at MetroTech, and the fire department became a single user building, and that was the building I built, and that was my first building out of the ground. And then we built for the courts, the state courts at J Street, and then all throughout this period, I was heading up the leasing inside of the buildings at MetroTech already, the one that Brooklyn Union Gas occupied, and Chase, and SIAC, Security Industry Automation Corporation. So I had to figure out how to move space. And I realized that Bruce didn't have relationships with brokers. We're going to get back to the broker. So I said, it seems like we need to get out of Brooklyn and really go meet the people. And so, again, I don't know where I got this idea, Bob, but I cold called 3 of the top brokers in New York City, and I set up lunch for Bruce and I to have a meeting with them at the Four Seasons. And MaryAnne Ty was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And she returned my phone call. I'd say that I got 3 lunches, but I probably had to call 10 brokers to get return phone calls. I mean, nobody knew who I was.
Right.
And MaryAnne had a rule, always returned a phone call, always. And so Bruce and I and these 3 top brokers, had lunch over the course of a number of months. And I remember Bruce screaming at me on the way into Midtown, like, "What are you doing? This is so stupid. These people don't want anything to do with us. What's going to come of this?" And I said, "Well, we're making deposits in relationships. And if we're going to keep building buildings, brokers are a lifeline, and we need to know the brokers." And I held my ground, and I forced them to go to these lunches. I didn't know if any of it was ever going to bear any fruit. And just by way of example, around a year after the lunch with MaryAnne Ty, now we're both named MaryAnne, we're both women in a business where there are not a lot of women, so I think we had a remarkable lunch that time, and I found her to be so inspiring, and she was an immediate mentor in the sense that I was deeply
Yeah, MaryAnne's one of those people,
amazed.
You sit with her for 5 minutes, you feel like you've known her for a long, long time. Very, very engaging, very likable. She's
And
great.
we laughed how little I knew. Lunch was in the pool room, and of course, lunch was always, the power lunches were not in the pool room, but I got the reservation, and I was like, "We're going to have lunch at the Four Seasons. That's all that matters." So in my young, innocent way, she had a lot of appreciation for my gusto and my audacity, I suppose. So a year hence, I had started to build the 42nd Street retail project. Remember when Disney needed 2 retail neighbors to keep them on 42nd Street? And we had gone to again, a strength of ours was going to the government and saying, "You guys are never going to find these 2 retail tenants. You've been kicking around AMC theaters, but now you have a timeline, and if you don't get this done, you're going to lose Disney, who had made this bold move to go to 42nd Street." So the state of New York gave us, I think, 90 or 120 days to seal 2 entertainment deals.
And people listening today might not understand what 42nd Street was like back in those days. I mean, it was, I remember, I started my career in 84 and lived in New Jersey at my dad's house. So I commuted through the Port Authority, and CB's office was at 49th and Madison. I'd walk down Madison to 42nd Street. From 42nd and Madison to 42nd and 8th, I crossed the street 3 different times to avoid certain things. That was really an extraordinarily transformative thing that happened on 42nd Street.
I think you're right. It's worth, just like Brooklyn, people don't understand. 42nd Street was a very gritty place. There was still a lot of peep shows there. We won the rights, and we nailed these 2 tenants. We got Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, and we had AMC Theaters, and we picked up the theater that AMC is located in today, and we rolled it down 42nd Street. Why? Because we knew that the retail in between, or on either side of these 2 tenants, would suffer mightily to be close to 8th Avenue, because
and
that
it was
the
a
Port
landmark
Authority
theater, right? Which is why you had to
We
preserve
put it on
and
tracks, and we made the Guinness World Book of Records, and we rolled the theater down. But this was really because it was so scary to be on 8th Avenue and 42nd Street at the time that we needed to bookend the retail that would go in the middle. And so that's why we did it. principally because it was a crazy dangerous place. So much so that I then was in charge of marketing the space in between these two anchors, and I decided again for whatever reason that I should put the marketing center on stage because who doesn't want to be on a Broadway stage? So I created a stage set in the Liberty Theater, which was a dark, dank theater, like an old rundown theater in Times Square. And I would meet tenants in that theater, and I would stand outside and wait for the broker to bring the tenant. And I literally would get stopped by policemen saying, "Are you lost? Like, what are you doing here?" And I would say, "I know." I tell my mother, I do meet people I don't know on the corner on 42nd Street. I go into a dark space and I come out 45 minutes later, but I have a really good, honest job. And so that was how crazy it was. I would inevitably be stopped by the police for standing outside of this dark, dank theater trying to lease it. And so that all meant that we were very qualified to build in Times Square. But MaryAnne had been hired by the New York Times, and she had been said to find a developer to partner with them. And it was that lunch that I had with MaryAnne that I took a lot of flack for, that she rang me up and she said, "I'm going to be inviting 5 developers. All of the other developers are Park Avenue developers. They're all Manhattan developers, but you just finished this massive project on 42nd Street. You know all the rules and regulations. You guys know how to build. I want to put you on the list." And I thought, this is incredible. And I ran into Bruce's office and he said to me, "You're wasting your time. There's no way we're winning because we are not Midtown developers." And I said, "Well, I think we just built something really important and big in Midtown." He said, "This is an office building." I said, "I think we build office buildings. Like every year we build an office building." He said, "Yeah, in Brooklyn." So Bruce and I had this debate, and I said, "I just want a chance to lose. Can you indulge me? I'll learn so much." He said, "You're going to waste time and you're going to waste money." And I said, "Well, I'll do it on a shoestring. It's a very quick process. This is a newspaper. They believe in deadlines. By Valentine's Day of 2000, they will make a decision. And I just really and truly want to try." And so he said, "Fine, you're going to learn a lesson." And we won. And I go back to this idea that meeting MaryAnne, her believing in me maybe more than I believed in myself, and this idea that I took myself so seriously. And I also knew that we needed to be different and we need to distinguish ourselves. I had this idea that the intern that I had for the summer should like crash into the boardroom in the middle of the presentation in a New York Times, a canvas bag and like a newspaper delivery boy with a cap on, and that he should pull out an oversized schedule with a giant scissor and cut the schedule in half to demonstrate that we knew how to build quickly. Again, we were laughing, we were serious. Every single person at the presentation had a role, and the New York Times scored every developer and every individual as part of every development team. And of course, years later, as we became their partners, I got my hands on those scorecards. And I will tell you that it was just a lifetime of learning in terms of what I was able to appreciate. And what it was we were serious, but we didn't take ourselves too seriously. Bruce came to the meeting, but Bruce didn't dominate the presentation. Every single person that was at the meeting had a role, and every single person was prepared for that role. We answered every single question, and the Times, it turns out, was interested in picking based on merit. And we won because it was a meritocracy. And that's a theme in my career, which is, the single biggest thing a woman can do in our industry is to weaponize competency.
And a couple of great lessons there. One, in a presentation, everybody should have a role.
Yes.
And the most important lesson is don't take no right away. Sometimes you keep going back and figuring out a way around the no, and that's exactly what you did, and look how it turned out.
And how about being underestimated? It's fabulous. I've been underestimated all my life. I think it's great because the Times, we were absolutely the underdog, and we had to come from behind and we had to win. We worked harder. We knew our stuff. There was so much more in it for us to win. It was so important for me to win, and it was the crown jewel of the company. Really, it was one of the most important projects that we ever built.
Awesome. Well, today everybody talks about Hudson Yards, but before Hudson Yards, there was Atlantic Yards.
There was.
Why don't you talk about it? And also, as you were going through each of these iterations within the company, you kept getting promoted, et cetera, et cetera. And so let's go to Atlantic Yards because I think that's a fascinating story.
So as a developer, you are what you build. So I had the great fortune of building the New York Times headquarters. And then from there, I built New York by Geary downtown, which was over 900 units, a vertical icon developed with Frank Gehry. I mean, it was the tallest thing that Frank Gehry had ever built. It was a rental building. If you had $50 million, you could hire Frank Gehry to design your home, but many of us would never have Frank Gehry designing our homes. And so how democratic it was to give access to New Yorkers to Frank's magic. And so that project was amazing for me. So New York Times, New York by Geary. As we're finishing New York by Geary, I'm thinking like, what could I possibly do that could be a follow-on to this incredible list of projects? And I don't think I worried about it, but I did wonder, like, how can it get any better than this? So proud of working with Renzo Piano, so honored to be working with Frank Gehry, building residential, building commercial, building retail. I had built 3 different asset classes. And in the world of a developer, you often have to pick one because it takes so very long to do what we do. But at Forest City, we were doing everything. And so not worrying about it too much, but can't deny that I thought about it, like what would be my next project? I got a phone call from Bruce and he said, you need to come see me. And he said, I need you to take over the project. So the person leading the project had left. And he said, it's yours to do. And I realized at that moment that as terrifying as it was, because for those of us that remember, highly contentious, big, complicated, condemnation, which made it, a very emotional thing for many. And so I thought my entire career has probably been for this moment, that I am ready to take on this Uber project, which is a great monumental example of what it takes to do anything big.
Not only a massive real estate project, but a political hot potato.
Yes, it had everything.
Mhm.
It had everything. And so I was asked to do it. I did it with a level of trepidation. I was confident that I was cut out for it, but I wasn't happy about the fact that it would be ugly. And ugly is the right word, just because I believed in it. But at the time, there were many people that didn't believe in it, and they were formidable. And so it was tough. And I'd say, like, the public hearings, the blogs, like I remember Bruce saying to me, the one thing I want you to promise me is that you're not going to read the blogs. And I said, I don't know if I can do that. And he said, you need to do that. And I said, I just don't think that's how I am. And I didn't listen to him. And I would go home and I would look at the things that were being said and spun.
What was the toughest about that psychologically?
It was really having an opponent. The opposition was very able-bodied and capable. And it was also, I'd say, the first project that I had ever been involved in where, because of technology, I'd be out in California working on something with Forest City in San Francisco, and somebody say, oh, you're working on that really controversial project called Atlantic Yards. And we had all the data, so we knew that the same group of people were just chipping away at the opposition. We had done extensive polling. Cranes had done regular polling. 65% of New Yorkers supported the project. It was hoops, it was jobs, and it was housing. But it was so muted and so diluted because technology would allow you to present as if it could be 10 people that hated the project or 10 million people. And so for me, what was mind-boggling is that I believed it was good for the city, and I believed that we needed to forge forward, and I believed in the bringing professional basketball back to Brooklyn. I believed in the design of the arena, which was a beautiful design, and I believed in the 6,000 plus units of housing, but it was a hard project. And so I'd say the fortitude you needed to forge forward was that you really better believe in what you're doing. But this idea that you couldn't tell where the opposition was, who the opposition was, how many people opposed it, purely by looking at the blogs or by social media, because it was really among the first large-scale projects that was done in the advent of the internet.
And there were local community groups. The city council person was against the project initially. Lots of hurdles to overcome.
And Tish James would, again, she was violently against the project, and she would pull me aside and say, I want to be you when I grow up. And she still would say that today. It was just so confusing. So I learned not to take it personal. And at the same time, I was ascending to become the CEO of the company, which was probably the hardest thing I ever did, was to step into Bruce Ratner's shoes, moving my family to Park Slope into the belly of the beast and realizing the hard way that I had been naive. And I laugh and say, I do like to think that I'm a Pollyanna sometimes.
Was that a strategic move to show commitment to the area?
No, it was that I had been in Edgemont, New York, where I believed my children needed grass between their toes, and I couldn't afford to raise 3 children in the city at the time that I moved up there. And then I was going to Brooklyn every day, and Bruce said to me, "You need to move to Brooklyn. You're going to be the CEO." And I thought, we had built this house in Edgemont. I loved Edgemont, and I thought, that's not my future. And I came home to the dinner table, and I said to the family, "What do you guys think about moving to Brooklyn?" And turns out Brooklyn had become cool, right? So my high school boys, the oldest said, "I've been telling you to get me out of the suburbs since I could talk. I'm going to be smoking a joint on the corner if you don't move me to Brooklyn." My second said, "If you make me a milkshake, I'll go." And my daughter said, "Mama, wherever you are, I am." And that was it. So everybody was excited about
There
Brooklyn.
you go. What year was that, MaryAnne?
That was 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had built the arena, right? So the arena had been built. There was much, much more work to do. But I moved a half a mile from the arena. But on the morning that I woke up with my family in my brownstone, I drew the blinds for my daughter up in her bedroom. And there was a giant sign hung on the back of a multifamily building facing my backyard windows that said, "F you, MaryAnne." But it was spelled out. And my daughter said, "Mommy, why would somebody say that to you?" It was a giant poster.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what have I done? I actually believed that I could bring my family close to my work. And I'd kept my children very close to my work in the sense that when you have great work like we have, people are moving paper or pushing buttons all day. I could bring my children into a hole when we dug a hole. I could bring them on a hoist when we built the Times building. I could go to a topping out. I could roll a theater down 42nd Street and they could watch. So I had the great benefit of bringing my children to these milestones so that they understood what I was doing. But now I had brought them into Brooklyn at a time when it was still so contentious. And that moment for me, I remember going in and saying to my general counsel, what are my rights? Somebody's now going to verbally assault me, put posters up
Mm-hmm.
facing my children's bedroom. And the footnote to that story is a lot of these folks are very passive aggressive. And so the children's father went over and asked the super to take the sign down. We left a note under the door saying we'd like to sit and talk about it. This gentleman didn't want to talk about it at all. He just wanted to, stir the pot. And so once I gave him an opportunity to sit across from me, he just disappeared. But it's tough business. And walking around Park Slope, I didn't know who was friend or foe. Was, my children were in a school that was around the block. And I did say to the headmaster, my children have to be judged on who they are, not who I am and what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And it was a very early lesson that I had to teach my children, is that you are not doing what I'm doing. Of course, they were believers, but there were some very, 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 very contentious periods of the project. And Park Slope really was the hotbed for the opposition. And I always say, I just wish I had the ability to have a low jack on all those people. So when they come into Barclays now, we could put their face up on the big screen and say, "Welcome to Barclays. We're so glad that you see the joy and the wonder."
Well, maybe we should talk to James Dolan about that, because he has the face recognition as you walk into the garden.
You're right. Well, I've moved on, obviously, and there's different owners now. But, there is nothing better than walking around Park Slope and seeing young children wearing jerseys and, strolling into that arena where it really just brings, I call it a whoosh moment. You may not be on the same team, but you're all rooting for something. And there's a lot of joy that building brings. And it's a beautiful building.
Beautiful building.
And so I'm completely resolved to all of it. I just wouldn't ever want to give the impression that it was easy.
Right. So unbelievable. Things are moving along. You're doing these massive, massive projects. And what happens after Atlantic Yards has gotten to a certain point?
Yeah. Well, there was never enough time in any given day for Atlantic Yards. It would just swallow you whole, because it was thousands of units of housing. It was millions of dollars of infrastructure. And it was going to take a long time to fulfill itself. So my work, even as the CEO of the company, was to continue that project. And at the same time, REITs were more popular. We were a public company, non-REIT. So Sam Zell said to me, "You're a family business dressed up in a public company dress." And he wasn't really wrong. I mean, the Ratners were a family business out of Cleveland. They had gone to the public markets in 1964. And suddenly everybody was focused on REITs in the public space. And we needed to, quote unquote, get in the REIT box because we were not a heavily traded stock after the financial crisis. The stock was depressed, and there was a lot of pressure on moving the stock up, not just for the family, but the shareholders. And with that, development became almost a dirty word. Nobody in the public markets wants to hear about long-term value creation. It's like quarter over quarter. And I was leasing space. I was running the company and the portfolio. But my first love was building. And I started to get heavy-hearted about the fact that we would never be building the things that we had built for at that point, 18 years that I had been there. We had done Cornell Technion when I was the CEO, amazing project. But when I sat with the analysts, who were all 28 to 32 years of age, they didn't really understand value creation through development because in the public markets, there's no patience. So I had this epiphany and I said, if building is my first love, this company is becoming a REIT one way or the other. It has to move toward a REIT because you can't be a public company and not be a REIT in real estate. And it's going to focus on being an operating company with a small amount of development. I'm out. So I went to the company and I said, I just have had an amazing run as CEO for 6 years. And I think I want to move on. And at that point in time, this company was like my family, the board, the family itself. And they said, well, we are going to be supportive of that, but we need you to stick with us because we're going through strategic alternatives. And there isn't a single person but you that can really explain what's happening on the corner of Flatbush and Atlantic. So it turned out Atlantic Yards kind of became my superpower because the company asked me to stay with them for 2 years as an advisor. They ended up providing the working capital for my new company because I said to them, well, I will do this with you, but I'm going to stand up a new company. I'm going to take people with me. And they said, well, that's fine. We're not going to be a developer anymore. You can have all the bragging rights to everything that we did with you while you were here, but we just can't have you abandon us. We need your help because we're going to have to explain this project to suitors, potential partners. And I said, as long as it's, a bankable, non-cancelable 2-year contract, I'll do it. So I stayed with them through their sale to Brookfield. And I also stayed with Brookfield for a while. And I helped usher in sort of the next chapter in Atlantic Yards, which had been rebranded to Pacific Park. And I followed my dream, which was to found a real estate development company that would focus on demonstrating you could build beauty and deliver value, not just for partners and investors, but for the communities in which we build. And you can do that looking something like the city we live in and not have it be the same old, and the usual suspects.
Yep. And I remember shortly after you formed your new company, the Gottesmans have been clients for decades. And they had an unbelievable property over on West 28th Street. And all of a sudden I heard you signed a ground lease for it. I was very, very surprised at the time. And tell us about what that was like, because those folks are not the easiest folks to deal with. Rightfully, they're very great negotiators. So that was a tremendous feather in your cap to come out of the box with.
Again, if you're not picking up on the fact that I really, really like hard, if it's not hard, I'm probably not interested. So that site had been, as you know, around for a while, and many developers tried to make a deal. I had met Moshe a few years before, and I asked him for an opportunity to make a deal because he knew of me. He basically gave me a very limited period of time and said he would bring it to the family. And I was able to do that. We had an understanding, and then we ultimately had a term sheet. And then we had a signed deal, and it's 480 units, not a small property, and it was the inaugural project for MAG Partners.
So that was the first project. Second project was the Ruby. Is that right?
Ruby's the first.
Ruby's the first. I'm sorry.
You should know that when possible, we name our buildings after unsung heroes who are women. A lot of developers name buildings after their children. I told my children that won't happen. And so we have a moment in the development of a project which is quite fun when we sit around and we go through the history of the site. And in the case of Ruby, which is across from FIT, Ruby Bailey was a beater, a fashion beater. And she came out of Harlem, and she was really never properly recognized for her talent. We went to the estate, And the family said, well, what do you need from us? And we said, just a smile and your emotional support. And then we went to FIT and we opened up a scholarship in Ruby Bailey's name. And we named our first building Ruby. The second building is around the corner, and it is MRH, which is the cooperative there, that giant swath of housing between
8th Avenue and
26th
Street.
and 29th Street.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the tennis bubble was. I learned every individual in real estate that played tennis once I was designated as the developer for that project. And we built a beautiful passive house building there. And then did some research again. It's an awesome, awesome site in a beautiful community where there are rolling meadows and parks and trees. You really feel it's otherworldly. You don't feel like you're in West Chelsea necessarily. And so in doing the research, we were committed to a passive house design, which you may know, there are not many passive house buildings in New York City. And we researched names and realized that the co-founder of the Audubon Society was Mabel Osborne, Wright was her name. And I did not know that there was a co-founder of the Audubon Society who was a woman. And so we have named that building after her in honor of her.
Fantastic.
And then the third project was Anagram Turtle Bay,
right,
which is on 50th and 2nd, which is another amazing project. Every building, every project
building was
has
spectacular, by the way.
Thank you. Love it. And that was an assemblage. Just talking about the power of a network, it was Kevin Wang, who I knew from back in the days, who called me and said, I'm assembling the site. I want to build a building. I don't know how to build residential, and I'm looking for a partner. And I said, well, assemblage is something I don't necessarily know how to do. You do the assemblage, I'll do the development. And Kevin is my partner there. And we put up a beautiful building, and we brought back Turtle Bay. When we marketed it, we came to realize that young people, a lot of whom are the demographic for that building, don't even know that Turtle Bay is this gem of a neighborhood on the Upper East Side. And so we love the idea that we've brought Turtle Bay back into the vocabulary of young urban professional New Yorkers who might be in finance or media or law. And it's a stunning building, and it's very different than Mabel, because Mabel is short and wide, and Anagram is tall and thin. And so,
and where are you in the development process there? How far along?
They both broke ground the same week.
Mm.
Mabel is 100% leased in West Chelsea, and we opened less than a year ago.
Wow.
And Anagram Turtle Bay is about 85% leased. And this is all within a year. So they are tremendously successful. Together, those three buildings are about 1,000 units. We have 30% affordability. And we are probably 2 days away from announcing another project, ground up in Manhattan, with a great partnership building under the 485X program, which will be one of a very few. You and I know we can't build our way out of a housing crisis 99 units at a time, but this is the program we've been dealt with. And so we are making our way through some real opportunities and working on buildings that are somewhere between 99 and 149 units and managing that very challenging program. But we're going to be building another building with a great partner, and we're going to be announcing it within the week.
Fantastic. Yeah. That's great. So from here, you're going to keep doing these fantastic residential projects?
I want to do more than that. I want to keep building principally in New York. We did go to Baltimore for a few years. It's an incredible city. People in Baltimore are incredible. It was a large, complicated project. Founder of Under Armour, Kevin Plank, asked me to go down there and help with the project. Goldman Sachs is a partner. We did that for a few years. It was a great way to experiment with exporting the talent. It's a very high-touch business, so I pretty much have a rule. You have to be able to get there and back in one day, and with Amtrak, usually you can do that. So I think we're now working on something in Miami, which is a 1.3 million square foot hotel condominium project, ground up, with a partner, and 2 potential office buildings in New York. And so Field of Dreams, we would capitalize these opportunities and be building not just multifamily, but also building Class A office in a city that needs it, like New York, and jamming in on a little bit of what's going on in Miami, which would be super fun.
Yeah, I mean, every developer that we work with here in New York that's building down in Florida says, Bob, it is an unbelievably different experience. The local politicians come over and say, hey, what you're doing is fantastic. How can I help you do more of these? And in New York, you can't even make a campaign contribution to a politician.
That is catharsis. Like Baltimore is the same thing. When I did not renew my contract to stay in Baltimore, the mayor of Baltimore called me to thank me for what I had done for Baltimore. And as very committed professionals, when you go to another place and they say you would take all that you learned in your profession in New York City and you would bring it to our city and make our city a better place, if that's, of course, how you're predisposed to doing it, because ever the student, like you don't want to roll into a city, Miami or Baltimore,
Right.
and act like you know everything you need to know. But if you're really open to learning about a new place, it's an incredible experience because New York is so tough. I always say the answer is, there's a reason why we have City of Yes. It's because we're the city of no. Somebody had to develop City of Yes because you have to stay addicted to hope. Like it's okay. Eventually somebody will say yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So MaryAnne, in addition to building beautiful buildings, what do you like to do when you're not building beautiful buildings? What would you like to share with our viewers about your interests?
Well, I love my family, and I always say that if I have to leave them every day, it better be good. So the bar was very high for me. I really had to love what I did just because I really love being a mother. My kids are older now, so I'm in a very different place. But while we can't have everything, I think it can be incredibly empowering for parents to have fulfilling careers and be able to bring children into that and have it be inspiring for them. And so they are really my reason. So I love being a mother and a parent. Believe it or not, I'm fairly introverted. Like I don't spend every waking hour thinking about how I can further my work on the weekends. Like I don't. I go to the North Fork of Long Island. We were talking earlier. I read I read non-real estate related things to manage my my stress and really decompress. I have a dog, and I'm getting a second dog, a puppy.
What kind of dogs?
I have a German short-hair pointer.
Mm-hmm.
She's a beauty, but she's pure liver, so she's chocolate, not the speckled brown and white. And I love to travel, and I'm still very, very curious about the world around me and how young people and the next generation are going to really contribute. So I'm dedicated to the rookie, and I say that in earnest because I think they are the future, and it's not just the rookie in real estate, but in anything. There's so much possibility. And so I sit on the board of Jefferies, so I'm on an investment banking board, and that is really important to me to stay really outside of my comfort zone and push into things that I may not be expert in and then become good at it. And so I'm doing a little bit of that with AI right now. And I think our industry needs to be disrupted, and we're probably going to be among the last to be disrupted. So I'd love to figure out a way through my own company to push the boundaries of AI in ways that are positive, uplifting, and make us better at what we do.
Okay, a couple of quick hits.
Sure.
Favorite type of food and favorite restaurant in New York?
I do love food. I like to eat at home when I'm in New York. I have favorite restaurants that are in the North Fork of Long Island. It's a farm to table movement. So I think my favorite restaurants are out there. And I'm too curious about all the restaurants I haven't quite visited in New York that if people are open to it, I'm always trying something new. And Babbo would be on my list. It's reopened, right? So I'd love to revisit that. It's been a long time.
Got it. You mentioned you love to read. A genre of books that is
Fiction.
Of most interest to you? Fiction?
Fiction. Yeah, it takes me away. You know, I like fiction just because I live in a world that's not fake. A lot of substantive things going on in my world, and there's a certain intensity to what we do. So I tend to read. I try to read quality books, but I tend to gravitate toward fiction.
Okay, and last question. Somebody living or dead that you'd like to have a cup of coffee or a drink with?
Eleanor Roosevelt.
What would you want to know? What would you ask her?
She just said so many wise things and lived at a time where she had such her own presence and her own way of being. And I would want to know what it was like to be a first mover, to be a maverick, to be a pioneer. I'm pretty fascinated with women that do it in a way that seems second nature, but it can't possibly be because it's still, unfortunately, quite remarkable for women to do big things. And I think that what would be amazing is when it's not so remarkable. It's just ordinary.
Well, MaryAnne, like Eleanor Roosevelt, you are a maverick, my friend. Congratulations on all of your success. Thanks for sharing your story with us. Really, really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time on The Bob Knakal Show.
Thanks for having me, Bob. And thanks for doing what you're doing because these stories hopefully do provide wisdom and inspiration for the next generation. So I appreciate you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the show, guys. You don't want to miss the next episode. Please subscribe. And don't forget, there's an opportunity to be in the live studio audience. So follow us on social media, and we'll make announcements about when the next filming is going to take place. We hope you enjoyed the Bob Knakal Show, which again was presented by our friends at Crexy, the most powerful platform on which to prospect, evaluate, connect, and close any real estate transaction.